Hello and welcome to Mental Health Matters. This is one of our quarterly specials. So we have up to 2 hours of really interesting debate, conversation, discussion about some of the most important mental health topics. Now, if you watched our previous special, which was on domestic abuse, that was sadly such a popular topic and so important, it sparked so much discussion that we have invited one of our keynotes from that panel back today. And she will be giving you a talk on narcissistic abuse recovery as well as trauma-informed therapy. And we'll be having a discussion about the importance of finding support and finding the right support for you when you've been through that sort of experience. We are absolutely thrilled because not only has she flown in from America to be here with us in the UK today, she has shared the stage with world-renowned trauma-informed experts such as Gabor Mate and Stephen Porges. We are delighted to welcome multi-award-winning narcissistic abuse recovery coach and hypnotherapist, Ronia Fraser. I'm going to hand it over to her.
Over recent years, and with pop psychology becoming more and more popular on social media, terms like trauma, trauma-informed have become real buzzwords. And on the one hand, it is a good thing because what it does is it raises the awareness about trauma. We started talking about trauma in a different way. All of a sudden, things that didn't work are done differently, and the holistic functional approach to well-being has become more and more acceptable. On the other hand, however, what happens when we overuse terminology like that, it desensitizes people, which means people are just not interested anymore. They don't want to hear about it anymore, and that in turn really takes away from the seriousness and the importance of the topic. Not to mention all the influencers and people in general who actually have made their trauma their identity and are really milking the topic for the sake of likes, for the sake of views, without actually taking responsibility for their own healing and not even interested in any solutions. It is important that we talk about trauma-informed care. It's important we have trauma-informed care, but we need to do it in the right way. My name is Ronia Fraser. I'm a multi-award-winning trauma recovery coach and clinical hypnotherapist, and I'm one of the leading experts in the field of narcissistic abuse recovery. I work with abuse survivors from all over the world to help them get back on their feet, regain their mental health, and recover who they were always meant to be. Unfortunately, over recent years, what has happened is that a lot of therapists, a lot of coaches, practitioners, and other professionals have simply added the term trauma-informed to their offering, to jump on the bandwagon and sell their services just because trauma has become this fashionable thing. Oftentimes without actually having the expertise, the training, and even less tools to provide their clients to actually help them out the other side. In today's session, I would like to share with you what trauma-informed really means. We will also be exploring what trauma actually is, dive deeper into post-traumatic stress, and I would like to really give you a good idea of what is out there and what you can expect when you are actually looking for help. So my intention for you today is to really take away the information that you need to make an informed decision as you go out there and explore different trauma recovery modalities. Now, let's get started with what is trauma-informed. What trauma-informed actually is not is having read about trauma, having experienced trauma, having watched a YouTube on trauma. None of that makes somebody trauma-informed. A trauma-informed approach is an approach that acknowledges the impact of trauma. It recognizes that most of us have experienced trauma in some form at some point in our lives. It recognizes that a lot of symptoms, a lot of behaviors we have are a direct result of a traumatic experience. And it also recognizes that the impact of trauma is actually really detrimental and lasting on a person's well-being and functionality. Now, the key to a trauma-informed approach is to facilitate the trauma recovery, resolving the trauma without re-traumatizing the client. It is supposed to give you a safe and non-judgmental environment, respectful, kind and empowering, and provide you with options and choice, and very importantly, practical tools that help you to do what you need to do to get out the other side of this. And that's already two things that a lot of very common supposed trauma-informed approaches fall short on. First of all, providing the practical tools, and secondly, resolving trauma without re-traumatizing, right? So those are two really, really solid keys of a trauma-informed approach. Now, what is also trauma-informed and really never is talked about, but it's incredibly important to understand, especially if you are working with trauma or would like to work with trauma. Many of us go in this profession because we want to help other people with our experience. Trauma-informed also means that you put strategies in place that protect you from secondary trauma, that you have a solid support network and a solid self-care routine. So as a practitioner, that means being trauma-informed. It's not just about facilitating the trauma recovery, it is also about safeguarding ourselves, because at the end of the day, if we are not well, we can't do our job. So if you're going out there and you're looking for a trauma-informed practitioner, feel free to ask those questions. Feel free to ask your therapist, your coach, what do you have in place to protect yourself? How does your self-care routine look like? Questions like that will give you a good indication if somebody actually is really trauma-informed or whether they're just, going along with it because it's fashionable. Briefly, I want to touch on what secondary trauma is, because it is rarely talked about. I know it wasn't mentioned in my training at all, and I know some of you want to go into this line of work or already started doing this line of work. Secondary trauma is trauma that's caused by witnessing somebody else's trauma, and that can be in different kinds of ways. Maybe we see something happen to somebody else, but it can also happen by seeing other people in emotional distress or listening to first-person accounts, to witness accounts. And it can literally happen to anyone at any time. Of course, the first people that come to mind are first responders. But of course, if we talk about trauma, if somebody comes in for therapy, we are the first responders, right? We are the first people. We get exposed to the story, and we get to see people in a lot of emotional distress. It can also happen to just anybody, even if they don't work in that field. I actually can remember once watching a very popular Netflix show, and there was this one scene that to me was so realistic and so horrific that I actually had a trauma response just by watching that one episode. I had to take my own toolbox out, get it on the table, and remove the flashbacks and the anxiety and the nightmares that were caused just by simply watching a show on TV. So secondary trauma very rarely gets mentioned, but it's a really, really serious thing that can happen to a lot of people. So I just wanted to throw that in there. And be mindful of that as well, especially when you are sharing your stories, right? So trauma-informed is not only about the client, it is about the therapist as well. And to be able to actually facilitate real trauma recovery, it is important that the therapist, the coach, the practitioner actually takes care of themselves and does the work as well. Now, What is trauma? When we think about trauma, usually the first thing comes to mind is some major life-altering event. And that is true. Of course, big life-altering events are traumatic. However, there is so much more to it, because trauma actually is any kind of adverse event, adverse experience that we don't have the emotional resources to deal with at the time. And it doesn't matter how big or how small. And you may have heard about big T and little t trauma. That's exactly what this is aiming at. If we have an accumulation of little things, little adverse experiences, the impact is not any different to a major traumatic event. Now, how does trauma get encoded? We all know people that have experienced the exact same thing and they are not reacting the same way, right? Somebody might have a trauma response while somebody else just brushes it off as if nothing has happened. So how does trauma actually get encoded? Of course, there are certain criteria that need to be met. First of all, there has to be an event, obviously. Then we have to give this event a meaning, and that's exactly where the experiences differentiate. If we give it a traumatic meaning, then of course the encoding is much more likely than if somebody doesn't give it a traumatic meaning at all. Thirdly, the landscape of the brain is incredibly important, because if we already have a vulnerable brain structure because of adverse experiences that we've had throughout our lives, maybe adverse childhood experiences, the landscape of the brain will be very, very different to somebody who hasn't, or somebody who's already done a lot of work on themselves, who has a lot of tools that helps them actually be resilient and deal with challenging situations in a much more healthy way. So we have the event, the meaning we give the event, the landscape of the brain, and lastly, the last criteria is inescapability. If we feel we are in a situation where we are stuck, where we can't get out, where maybe we don't have the support that we need to deal with this situation, whether that's actually true or just perceived, it doesn't matter. Those 4 criteria will determine whether trauma gets encoded in the body or not. What usually happens is also that the trauma then gets encoded, but it may lie dormant for a while. And then something happens that pushes that button, the trauma gets activated, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a mental health crisis. But oftentimes that connection isn't even made, right? That's why it's really, really important to find somebody who is genuinely trauma-informed, because trauma is very multi-layered and it can be rather complex. We don't only have the big T trauma and the little t trauma, we also have to distinguish between acute trauma and developmental trauma. Now, if we use, for example, narcissistic abuse as an example, if somebody comes out of a narcissistic relationship, they usually suffer from a whole range of mental health challenges as a result of what they have experienced. Now, if you then go and ask for help, which you really should do, it's okay to ask for help, you may be lucky to find somebody who can actually give you the tools that you need to stabilize your emotional well-being, to remove your triggers, to put your feet back on the ground. And that may seem sufficient, and then they send you on your way. It's very likely that you actually may come back within 6 to 12 months, because either, the client goes back to their abuser, or they just found somebody else who's a different shade of narcissist that they hadn't quite figured out yet. And the reason for that is because especially complex trauma is much more complex than a singular traumatic event. There is so much more to it, which means the first course of action will be treating the acute trauma, obviously. But then we actually need to dive deeper to actually explore what is this all about. Because unless we break that pattern, it will happen over and over and over again. So acute trauma always first course of action. But if you are dealing with complex trauma, like for example narcissistic abuse, it is really, really important to dive deeper. Trauma impacts us on so many different levels. It impacts us emotionally, it impacts us mentally, physically, spiritually, and all of those levels need to be addressed for real trauma recovery. Developmental trauma can be adverse childhood experiences. It can also be a whole range of little t traumas. Seriously, something that someone said or did, probably without even thinking about it, without having any bad intention whatsoever. But because we didn't have the emotional resources, we didn't have the life experience at the time to deal with it, it got stuck. And in narcissistic abuse, those faulty programs, outdated programs, usually run along the lines of feeling unseen, feeling unheard, feeling unworthy, unlovable. A very, very common faulty program that a lot of men and women have running in the background is actually not being good enough. And those kind of faulty programs is what actually gets us into trouble in the first place, over and over and over again. So when we are looking for a real trauma-informed approach, it is important that the coach, therapist, practitioner knows about big T and little t trauma and actually goes down into the nitty-gritty and not just focuses on the big things, but also understands the difference between acute trauma and developmental trauma. And that's also, again, where the tools come in that are so important to facilitate actual trauma recovery. So now that we have explored what trauma is, let's dive a little bit deeper into how it presents itself. Because when we have experienced trauma, as I already mentioned, it affects us on so many different levels. And there will be a whole range of symptoms that a trauma survivor will experience. Now, first and foremost, there will be severe anxiety. And that is really anxiety. I'm talking about 24/7, whether you're awake, whether you're asleep. Really simple tasks like going to the grocery store become impossible. I remember for myself, it was literally a 2-hour discussion every single time until I talked myself into being able to even leave the house. So it's the little things, day-to-day life becomes impossible. We are talking about depression. We are talking about difficult to control emotions, flashbacks, nightmares, night terrors, hypervigilance, what else? There are so many, actually. Erratic behavior, self-harm, self-destructive behaviors, which is a really interesting one, actually, because when we think about it, we usually think about things like somebody's cutting themselves or alcohol or drugs, but it can be so much more than that. It can be shopping, it can be food, it can be tattoos. Right? So when we actually look at self-destructive behavior, we got to think out of the box a little bit. Suicidal ideations, very, very common for trauma survivors. So as you can see, every single one of those symptoms in itself would be completely debilitating. But a trauma survivor is very likely to experience all of those symptoms all at the same time. So as you can see, trauma recovery is not a walk in the park. So just reading an article about it, doing a one-day training, watching a YouTube about it, it is not sufficient, because what we are actually dealing with here is potentially severe mental health challenges, right? And that's why it's so important that we really get clear on what trauma-informed really means. And of course, again, providing the tools to be able to work through all of those symptoms. Now, if you are experiencing those kind of symptoms right now, as you are listening, I really want you to hear me when I tell you that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. It's oftentimes painted that way, but what you are experiencing is an absolutely normal response to an incredibly abnormal situation. You got to put the work in. It's not going to go away by itself. And you will need to ask for help, because you will need the guidance and the tools to be able to come out the other side of this. Having said that, there is nothing wrong with what you are experiencing right now. Now, post-traumatic stress is life-altering until we actually receive the right guidance and the right tools. The challenge we see when somebody experiencing post-traumatic stress is they take this list of symptoms that I had just mentioned, and they go to somebody and they might get a PTSD diagnosis. At least that diagnosis acknowledges that something bad has happened to them that turned them into this mess, right? Now, somebody else might take the same symptoms, go to somebody else, and they get a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, which indicates there's something wrong with their personality. Now, language matters. Language is really important. And just by receiving a label like that, it will already very much determine the perceived ability to heal, right? So if you're experiencing any of those symptoms, please know that this is a trauma response. The way that you are feeling is absolutely valid, and that there is help that's available out there. The biggest challenge is it depends on who you talk to, right? What their expertise is, what their attitude to mental health is, what their attitude to women is. Not saying it doesn't happen to men as well, but borderline personality disorder is a very female diagnosis. So please be really mindful that regardless of the label that you may have been given, what really matters is the symptoms that you are experiencing, and with real trauma-informed care, there is a way that helps you out the other side of that. And it doesn't have to be this long and painful and lifelong journey it's made out to be. Exploring why traditional therapy is not as effective as we would like. Oftentimes we don't get the results that we are looking for, and there's a very simple reason for that actually. So why does traditional therapy not get the results that we are looking for? When I talk about traditional therapy, I'm talking about counseling, I'm talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and there's nothing wrong with those intervention methods. What I'm saying is there is a place and there is a time, and trauma recovery is not it. So if you go somewhere, and it's very popular nowadays, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a contradiction in itself. And the reason for that is that trauma recovery never happens in the cognitive function. And you can see that when people go to therapy over and over and over again for years, but they are not actually getting any better. And the reason for that is because the supposed healing is restricted to the cognitive function. Now, narcissistic abuse survivors are actually the best example for that, because I have not met a single survivor who couldn't write a PhD on this topic. All of us have this really in-depth knowledge, but despite of all this in-depth knowledge, they're not feeling any better. They're still struggling with their mental health. And that is a very clear indication that there is one more step to that, right? So obviously, learning, studying, figuring it out cognitively is a very important part of the healing journey, because we're brainy people. And if you have experienced narcissistic abuse, that experience is so out of this world. Of course, we need to get our head around it. But if we want to actually heal, we need to dig deeper, because we need to access the trauma on the same deep level that it is caused. Another reason traditional therapy doesn't give the results that we're looking for is the way the brain works. We actually cannot distinguish whether something is happening for real or whether you're imagining it. The chemical responses, the neurological reactions in the brain are exactly the same. So as somebody goes to counseling or CBT and talks about their experience over and over again, analyzes it over and over again, what happens is for the mind, for the body, it's literally as if it's happening again and again and again. So a real trauma-informed approach needs to take the healing out of the cognitive function. There will be a point where you know everything you need to know, and I'm not saying everything there is to know, because being a buzzword, whether that's narcissistic abuse or trauma, every day there is somebody who comes up with something new. It doesn't matter. There is a time you know everything you need to know. And then it's time to move into the real healing work. And remember, a trauma-informed approach is all about practical tools that help you be self-sufficient and help you work through the trauma without re-traumatizing to get you out the other side of this. What are modalities that are useful? Luckily, we live in the day and age where there are many options available now to explore. And I actually encourage everybody to be curious and to go out there and try out new things. Some will work, others won't work, but there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? Modalities that have proven themselves very, very effective in trauma recovery are, for example, hypnosis, neurolinguistic programming, havening techniques, and I will address all of those in a little bit more detail in just a moment. And it's really about finding your mix and match that works for you. There will be things that worked for me wonders, but do nothing for you. There will be things that you try out, not worked for me. It doesn't matter. It's about being curious. It's about trying out different things. Whatever works for you, you're going to put it in your toolbox. Because at the end of the day, a trauma-informed approach is meant to help you build your toolbox that doesn't only help you deal with the situation you're in right now, but actually with life's challenges from this day forward. And it's supposed to make you self-sufficient rather than keeping you on the schedule for the therapist to pay their rent, right? That's what a trauma-informed approach is really about. Now, let's talk about hypnosis. Hypnosis has nothing to do with the hypnosis you see on TV. Real hypnosis is not about making people run around like chickens. That's show hypnosis. It's not used in trauma recovery. In trauma recovery, hypnosis is actually a very invaluable tool because it, first of all, helps us regulate the nervous system, which is incredibly important. Remember the landscape of the brain we talked about? So regulating the nervous system is incredibly important because what it allows us to do is become response able rather than being responsive and just firing off emotional triggers. It also teaches you that a state of calm and deep relaxation and peace is accessible to you. Now, if you've been highly activated for a long time, this may seem impossible. But that's where the beauty of hypnosis comes in. Because once we experience this real deep sense of calm and realize how easy it is, you can go back there anytime you need. Self-hypnosis is actually a thing as well. I do it all the time. That's the power of hypnosis, to help you regulate the nervous system. But what it also does is it allows you to access your unconscious mind. It allows you to access your inner wisdom. Because you can have the best therapists in the world. At the end of the day, they are not you. Nobody can tell you what the right thing is for you to do to come out the other side of this. Just because I've experienced narcissistic abuse doesn't mean I can tell you step by step exactly what you need to do, because your circumstances are very different to mine. Hypnosis allows you to actually access your inner wisdom. It allows you to find answers that are right for you in your particular situation. And what it also allows us to do is really access the damage on that deep level that it was caused. Taking it out of the cognitive function, stopping to figure out, trying to figure out why. Your unconscious mind already knows why. So hypnosis, incredibly powerful and beautiful. Once you really experience it, your mind and your body will be very, very welcoming to this new experience, this new state of being. So I can highly recommend it. Trauma recovery however, is an advanced form of hypnosis, right? So if somebody has done their 3-day training to do smoking cessation and insomnia and weight loss, those are not the kind of hypnotherapists you would like to see for complex trauma, but it is available, and it's incredibly, incredibly powerful and very quick as well, because you can target exactly where you need to go. Neuro-linguistic programming, very, very compatible with hypnosis. And while hypnosis allows us to go into this altered state of consciousness, NLP is what gives us the tools to actually make changes. And whether that is regaining our self-confidence, our self-esteem, removing triggers from the post-traumatic stress, it also allows us to update those faulty and outdated programs that I was mentioning before, which is the key to real deep trauma recovery. There are many beautiful tools, techniques that we can use in NLP in combination with hypnosis, which will make change possible in a very quick and a very, very effective way. And the beautiful thing with that actually is it's so scary to start out with, I'm not gonna lie. However, once you realize how much power you hold over your mind, over your body, over your life, that's where the fun actually begins. So anybody who's struggling right now, again, I would like to encourage you to really be curious and try out different things. Havening techniques is another modality that is very effective for trauma recovery. It's a psychosensory modality that's based on touch, and it's something that you can actually do for yourself. Remember, as I said, it's all about building your own toolbox to be able to just handle life in a completely different way. All of those modalities allow you to access the trauma on a deeper level outside of the cognitive function. And what you can nicely do is not only stabilize your emotional well-being by regulating your nervous system, becoming more response-able rather than reactive, which obviously opens up the doors to so many more options. As you can imagine, if you have the capacity to actually pause for even a millisecond rather than flying off the handle, you have so many more options to deal with the situation. And you can also address things that keep getting you into trouble, things that are not working for you. And that can be real deep trauma recovery. It can be things like, I don't want to eat chocolate anymore, So it's really about doing what works for you, and a real trauma-informed approach does have the tools to make that possible for you. Now, those are the main 3 modalities that I use in my practice. As I said, it's all about the mix and match. There are so many other things out there. We have, for example, EMDR or IEMT, where it's all about the eye desensitization, removing emotional charges from memories, which allows you to neutralize any experience. We have breath work, we have Reiki, we have EFT, emotional freedom technique, tapping. There are so many things out there that actually are really, really suitable. But remember, a trauma-informed approach will be outside of the cognitive function. And I encourage you to just go on Google, to type in what I just shared with you, see what resonates with you, try something out. Very likely you will meet somebody on the way who has experience with something else that piques your curiosity. And that's what trauma recovery is really about. It's not about telling the story. It's not about figuring out, trying to find fairness in this or justice, because trauma is not fair and it never will be fair. It's not about analyzing it down to the tiniest little T, because you may have already done that, but you already know that you have not gotten the results that you are looking for. I know this is a lot of information to process. It might even take a day or 2 until all this information that's relevant for you actually sinks in. But I really want you to know, whatever your reason is for watching this show today, that everything is okay. Everything will be okay. There is so much help out there, even if it may not feel like that right at the moment, but that's also the purpose of this show today. And yeah, keep going, one step in front of the other, and you're not alone in this. And that's very, very important to realize.
Ronia, thank you so much, not only for flying all the way from America to be here, but for such an interesting and fascinating talk that you gave.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
It's really our privilege and pleasure, both the same, because you pointed out so many things that I think all of us know but haven't quite been able to put our finger on, and you've been able to explain it so well. And I just wanted to ask you a few questions around your talk, if that's okay.
Of course.
The first was about the people who use trauma as their identity. And we see this a lot, people always talking about the trauma. And the one thing I've always thought when that happens is all you're doing is going over everything, and therefore you're staying stuck. But the thing that you said in the talk about secondary trauma and that potentially causing problems for other people, that's a huge thing as well. So what would you say to people who have made trauma their identity? How do we help them move forward from that?
I mean, the thing with identity is it doesn't matter what we make our identity. Identity is a difficult thing to change, because if somebody even gives well-meant advice and, trying to put you in the right direction, if somebody attacks your identity, you're going to get really defensive about it, right? Whether that's like I'm a smoker or I'm a trauma victim. I mean, the language there already makes a difference as well. If it's the identity, it all of a sudden seems impossible to change. So the first step really would be like taking it out of the identity, because I'm not a smoker, I smoke, right? A behavior is much easier to change. I survived trauma, so you're not taking away from what has happened, but it is not the identity. And again, that is a conscious decision. It's a decision anybody can make. But of course, if we're talking about influencers, some make really good money with having that their identity. And then obviously there just won't be a resolution. But that kind of also plays into, there's a thing called spiritual narcissism.
Yes.
Where, the outside appearance is very enlightened, very self-aware, really putting the work in, but actually they are not, because if they were, their mental health would improve, so they wouldn't need to constantly go over their mental health challenges that they are experiencing. And I think that's where the big difference is, and obviously it's a personal decision that everybody makes for themselves. I remember once I did a panel discussion at a conference, and there was this lady who, she just loved her own voice, She was just telling her story over and over again. And at one point she said, I wish there was something that, would resolve the trauma. And I'm sitting there and I actually said to her, well, I mean, if you want, we can talk later. I developed this program specifically for that purpose. And she didn't respond at all. She just was like startled a little bit and then went back into her story, and she never reached out or wanted to actually talk about it, and because obviously it would take away her identity and the likes and the followers, which I actually don't think is true, because it's a very different energy. You can go from this energy to a very forward moving and healing energy, which is incredibly empowering.
Yes, absolutely. And it would be in many ways the same number of likes and followers, but different
maybe
people.
Even more.
Yeah. Because they see you as that inspiration to be able to heal.
Yeah, and it's authentic then as well, rather than having a little pity party.
Yes, which, as we come back to, just it can keep you in that same place, and the more you tell that same story, the more ingrained it becomes.
And by the way, I'm not saying you're not allowed to tell your story, right? Because we all are allowed to tell our stories. there are so many horrific things that people experience, but there is a time and there is a place. And I think that's really, really important because, again, if we talk about narcissistic abuse, for example, it's part of the whole game to make us look crazy. So as we're emotionally unstable and we keep banging on about our story, people think we've lost our minds. People call us crazy. People don't listen because we're too much. We're actually too much, right? Because we're emotionally not in the right place.
Yes.
So if you are actually dealing with that kind of trauma recovery, remember the brain can't distinguish if something's happening for real or whether you're imagining it. So as somebody goes through the healing journey, which again is also part of being trauma-informed, is stop telling your story. Focus on your healing work, really from the inside out, and then you can tell your story. I tell my story, but now nobody would ever call me crazy. People are actually listening. It comes from a very different place. The story hasn't changed.
Yes,
right.
That's right. That's right. And I'm actually really glad you brought up this phrase "too much" because I do understand that that's one of those phrases that people push back against quite a lot because it's not fair to tell, say, a young girl who's just quite assertive, she's too much. But what we're talking about here is somebody who's in a very different energetic space, who is kind of dumping a lot of that energy on people. And those are two very separate cases.
Yeah.
How do we... I'm going to go on to asking about
And not only energy, right? Content as well, which goes back to the secondary trauma.
Yes.
Because it's very graphic, because what we have experienced, and I've done the same thing, but nobody wanted to listen. And then we find ourselves in situations where all of a sudden all of our friends desert us, and we find ourselves in like literally the darkest hour of our lives, totally on our own, which actually isn't true, but it feels that way. And a lot has to do with that, because the stories, when we are in this victim mindset, they are just so detailed, so graphic.
Yes.
And remember when we talked about a secondary trauma, listening to that can actually cause a response in somebody else. And you don't know what that other person has gone through. It might even trigger something that they have. So it's their right to go like, no, you are too much. I have to protect myself and my mental health. I got to step away. But then, of course, as the person in this situation, it's incredibly painful. And you don't understand. You just feel abandoned. But that's not actually what's happening.
Yes. It relates very much to your point about safeguarding.
Yes.
And it is about all of us, not just therapists and coaches, safeguarding our own selves. So how do you do that? And how might you suggest we could do that if we have that friend who is always telling their graphic story?
Yeah. I mean, I do this professionally.
Yes.
So the most powerful thing, if you work in this field professionally, that will protect you is to do your own work first. Because if you are clean, it allows you, like you've weeded out your garden, you don't have the buttons to be pushed. That allows you to actually hold the space in a very clean manner. There is no interruption there. There's no nervous energy because somebody says something that might affect me because of my experience. So the best way to protect ourselves from that is always doing our own work, because if there is no button to push, there's not going to be an emotional response. And then it's also okay to communicate to somebody, and they may not like it, but you can say, listen, this is too much for me right now. I can't deal with this right now. I need to step away. And the thing is, when somebody is in this victim mindset, they will stay there most likely as long as they can because they're being enabled to. But all of a sudden, if you find yourself in a situation that, it happened to me as well, where there's just no one around anymore, and I just got so tired of telling the story and feeling sorry for myself. I got to the point where I'm like, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm done with feeling this way, And that's when my mindset shifted, where it's like, there's got to be something that moves this forward. But of course, as long as there is always somebody who enables that, feeling sorry for yourself, and it's always the same advice, they're not going to take it anyway.
Yes, yes.
Right?
And this relates very much to your point about how cognitive therapies may not help you access and move forward, because the cognitive therapy is all about retell the story, keep processing, keep learning. And it's about breaking that pattern.
And it gets you to a certain point.
Yes.
And it serves its purpose, but it just will not get you the whole way. So counseling anyway, because counseling is just about the talking aspect of it. Cognitive behavioral therapy may get you to a point where you realize what the actual problem is, like what is this really about? Like, for example, the narcissistic relationships. How come that I keep getting into narcissistic relationships? And it may even help you identify those faulty programs from way back when that get you into trouble. But then basically you are told that now you know, and it's not serving you, so behave differently. But we are all emotional beings. So before we do something, we always feel something first. And we can force ourselves to behave differently as much as we like, because we know it's not serving us, but there will be a situation where it's just going to snap, because the emotion is still happening.
And it hasn't been addressed.
And that's why it's important when we do trauma recovery that we actually get really into, like, down onto that level where we can resolve it from an emotional point of view, because that will always be the first reaction.
Yes.
And that goes back to, if there's no button to push, there's no emotional response, whether that's like an outside trigger or dealing with people, and whether that's a narcissist or a difficult person at work or a parent or whatever. Other people always push our buttons. We don't push our buttons ourselves. So really taking care of that, the way we respond is very, very differently, because it doesn't come from an emotional reaction.
Yes, of course. So on that, how do we find the right therapist? Because it's not just about knowing the type of therapy that suits you, but it's also the rapport with the therapist. It's also whether perhaps even the therapist, you use 3 different modalities, probably more than the NLP, hypnotherapy, and havening, which you talked about. How do we know that therapist is going to perhaps give us those options, give us those choices?
I mean, it's important to do your research. And especially now that trauma has become this fashionable thing and everybody is trauma informed, it makes it very tricky. But it's very important to do your research and ask the right questions as well. As I already said earlier in the talk, it's okay to ask them about their experience, about their healing journey, about their self-care routine. Things like that, because that will give you an actual idea who you are dealing with, and whether it's just a label they added to the offering or if they've actually done their own work. And make sure that they're accredited by a governing organization, because obviously we have a lot of social media influencers now that are experts in the field. But as I said earlier, just because having experienced a certain kind of trauma, it doesn't make you... It maybe makes you an expert in that kind of trauma, but not in the recovery. And there is actually a lot of harm done by people like that, because they are not trained. They are not trained in linguistic. They haven't been, they haven't been doing their own work. And so it's really, really important to do the research. And it's also something we can feel, because when we work with somebody, there is a sense, either you feel safe and you can literally allow yourself to surrender, which is needed for trauma recovery, or there is like some nervous undercurrent that's like constantly there. And that actually in itself is an indication that you are sitting across from somebody who hasn't done the work, because something got activated there. And there's a lot of energy involved, right?
Yeah.
But you can actually feel it. And if somebody is questioning right now whether their therapist or coach is right for them, they actually already know the answer.
Yes, that's a very, very good point there. Relating to that, you have been through your own experiences, you've had to go through the healing process. Is that an important part of being a trauma-informed coach, or can you be a good trauma-informed coach without having had that experience?
I think it makes you a better coach or therapist because you can relate on a very different level. You can relate on a cellular level. It's not something you read about in a book. So when somebody comes to you, especially, for example, again, in narcissistic abuse recovery, when somebody comes to me in the beginning, they probably don't even have the language to express what has happened to them. Yeah. I understand anyway. I get it a lot where people talk to me and then they apologize for just not being more eloquent. And I'm like, it's okay. I understand exactly what you're talking about. So it allows me to relate in a more authentic way. Having said that, again, it comes down to doing your own work. Yeah. So if you have experienced it and you want to help other people, so it's a good intention. Yes. Right? It's a really good intention. Yeah. But if you haven't done your own work, then you can only take somebody as far as you've gone yourself. And I think that's very important in trauma work.
Yes, yes. And so, yeah, I think that is too, really. Therapists needs to be able to hold the space without being triggered themselves. But when somebody has been through the experience and done the work, there may be a deeper level of understanding which the person who's just done the study may not be able to access. It doesn't necessarily mean that person can't do it, but
might not get all the way. Yeah. And there may be an energetic disconnect there where the client just doesn't feel fully understood because they just need to do more explaining and it just doesn't flow as naturally. I mean, the tools, if you have the right tools, at the end of the day, trauma recovery is about the tools. Yeah. And it almost doesn't matter what tools you are given. If you're ready, you're going to use the tools like you use them, right? And I mean, I didn't have the guidance in the narcissistic abuse aspect. It didn't exist. So I also just took the tools I was given. My coach had no idea about the experience. It hasn't happened to him himself, whereas now he has like a little bit more, a better understanding where he goes like, oh, that's actually interesting. But you can facilitate the healing, but then it also depends on the personality of the person you're working with. Like I was so determined to get out the other side of this. Not everybody has that personality. There are people that really need the guidance and the support to help them through the other side. And I think that is just more effective if you've had the experience, that particular experience they are coming for, and have done your own work.
Yes, yes. No, I see what you're saying, because if someone does need that extra bit of time or whatever it might be, if you've been through it, you get that. You just simply get it. Yeah. And you know how to almost help them and with a bit more guidance. Another thing you mentioned, which I think is really important for us to point out, is the difference between the big T and the little t and the accumulation of all the little t's, which can become quite a big T. So it's almost, I guess, if a child is always told, calm down, be quiet, that in itself could build up to them thinking, I can't be who I am.
Yeah, and you can't express yourself. Yes. You know, you don't have a voice, things like that. It can be like really simple things, even in school. Like a lot of faulty programming happens in school when we get called out in front of the class, for example, or the class starts laughing at us, or things like that. I have actually quite an interesting, I didn't even know it was a thing, but it came up in one of my healing sessions that I did for myself, was a lot of us have a fear of abandonment, right? And then so the thought is like, oh, that child has been neglected or whatever. I had a great childhood. Yeah. But in one of my sessions, what came up was me being like really small. I was on my mom's arm, and my dad, he was in sales. So he would travel a lot, and we would be at the window and just waving him goodbye.
Oh, gosh.
But as a child, as a little toddler,
Yes.
you don't actually have the emotional resources or the experience to understand he will be
He's
back.
coming. Yes.
So my dad actually only went to work. And then all of a sudden I'm in my 30s and it comes up when as a fear of abandonment. He just went to work, you know, like he didn't do anything to me.
Yeah, yes.
He just went to work. He did his job, but as a child, because I didn't understand, I was so little, it was always that fear of like, is he actually going to come back? You know, and it can be like stuff like that.
Yeah, and this again is, I'm really glad you mentioned that experience, because it's always with the parent, if you're thinking about your mother, why would she feel the need to explain, oh, he's only going to work? Because you don't think that this is, it's not a problematic situation at all.
He was going to work, he came back a few days later, then a few days later he would go again. So it would be repetitive, but then at the same time, when it happens the first time, that's all that's needed.
Yes.
And I didn't know I had that. I was very surprised when it came up in my healing work, but it can literally be things like that.
That's really interesting, and that kind of then relates to your next point. Honestly, I made so many notes. It was fascinating about the problem of diagnoses and the problem of, oh, well, that's clearly a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. That's obviously a BPD diagnosis, and that can be very limiting as well. Absolutely. Is getting that diagnosis. Yeah. Whereas what you're saying is these fears, these anxieties. It is just a simple, well, not simple, it's a complex, but it is a trauma response.
Yes.
And keeping it broad actually means more help feels like it's available, rather than, I have BPD, therefore I can only be treated by this particular
but then
therapy.
Again, you know, it's like, are you taking the ownership of the label that's been given to you? Or is it just informative, but you're still, you know, doing what you need to do to come out the other side of it? And I mean, I am not a big fan of labels. I know it helps some people, especially in the beginning when they're still trying to figure out what's going on. But when I work with somebody, I remove all labels, including the narcissistic abuse label.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
Because it's another term that's being so overused. And I don't care if you want to call them a narcissist, a psychopath, just whatever, fill in any word you want to fill in. I don't care. What I care about is what's going on for you and the symptoms that you're struggling with and how I can help you.
And actually the removal of the label is really important, because what we're talking about here is otherwise you're just treating the acute trauma, the narcissistic relationship, and then that person goes, well, I came because I was in a narcissistic abuse relationship. I'm all better now. But of course, if the trauma is developmental, small t's, there's a lot more to deal with, and to stop them going back into another relationship. That's so important. Absolutely. So important. Something that we've had a lot on this show, in fact, is a lot of people saying with talking therapies, I'm really good at processing. I'm very good at understanding. Almost you get into a bit of paralysis by analysis. If we are trying to help somebody, or if we are that client themselves recognizing this, or when I mean we're trying to help somebody but we realize we're a talking therapist, how do we recommend our client to someone else? Or how does the client themselves ask, well, maybe I need to be looking at something a bit more holistic, a bit more somatic?
Well, I don't know, I'm German, so I always say it how
it
is.
Yeah.
I mean, as a therapist, it has to be in our own interest to help our clients. And I mean, as I said earlier, there's so many different modalities out there now. I have my own strings to my bow, but I don't feel the need, because sometimes people go like, oh, you should get trained in this and you should get trained in this. I'm really good at what I do with what I have. I introduce people to different modalities. Yes. If they like it, I refer them on. Same as my colleagues might refer somebody to me because they got to a point where they're stagnant.
Yes.
And I mean, there is no place for ego in therapy.
I agree with you, yes.
So, and as a client, if you feel stuck, you feel stuck. Just say, I want to try something else because I'm clearly not getting the results that I'm looking for. And it's what happened to me as well, where I got just so frustrated going to therapy week after week after week, traditional therapy. And not getting any results. I mean, if I put my time and my money and my tears into something, I want to see things change, and it just didn't happen. And when I brought it up with my therapist, the response was, well, unfortunately, that's how your life is now, and it's something you need to accept, and we will find ways to manage it. But if you're at the end of your road, if you can't promise you're still around tomorrow, that's not a state of being you can just accept. No. And that's how I ended up, going on this mission to find something that would reverse the damage. And if you don't get the results that you're looking for, it's okay. Like, whatever you've been doing, it clearly served a purpose up to this point, and now it's time to level up. And that's absolutely okay.
I like looking at it that way. That's really nice. It is. Yeah, because I think sometimes you are right. There is a place for talking, to understand and to actually get to possibly the root. Yeah. But if you can't then deal with the root through talking. Yeah. It does need something else.
And sometimes I also get people that go like, oh, I wish I had found you 2 years ago. And I'm like, no, you know what? The timing is always right, because Agreed. 2 years ago you wouldn't have been ready for that kind of deep work. Yes. You needed the help and support you got to get to this point.
Yes.
Right? So everything, well, that's how I believe healing work, or the life in general really works. Like, things come your way when you're ready to deal with them. So if somebody comes to me when they're out of their narcissistic relationship for 2 weeks, They can't even handle or comprehend what I have to offer because they are just not there yet on their journey. So then, counseling might be very useful at that point, because there are a lot of logistics to be sorted out. Things like that.
Yes. I think that's important for everybody to hear, not only the client, but also therapists out there. Yeah. We need to leave egos at the door. It's so important. If you are not the right person to support that client, recommend somebody else. And
then if you're the client and you feel you're not getting what you're looking for, it's okay to try something else. And as a therapist, just be really clear on where on that journey for somebody you position yourself. Yes. So I'm very clear. I'm literally the end point.
Yes.
I'm the person people come to when I'm the last resort, most of the time. But also when they are ready, when they've had enough, when they've reached that point where they literally go like, just give me what I need so I can do what I need to do. Yeah. That's the kind of people I work with. But not everybody is comfortable with that. So then, but be very clear where you position yourself, because it's also expectation management for the client. If somebody comes to you for help, this is what you provide. Yeah. And then there is also not the disconnect when you've reached that point of your capabilities to then allow the client to move on and do what they need to do.
Yes. And what I loved about your talk as well, relating to that, is that you talked us through some of the modalities that you use. Now, hypnotherapy, we've had a number of guests on the show, so we've talked about that one quite a lot. We've got a strong understanding of that. NLP to some extent as well. Havening is something we have not discussed on the show at all. No. It's only something I've started reading about actually through your book, because I liked this idea of almost, I see it as a bit of self-soothing.
It is.
But it's possibly a bit deeper than that as well. Do you mind explaining havening in a little bit more depth and maybe taking me through a havening exercise?
Absolutely. I mean, havening for me is one of my favorite things to do, because it's just so simple and incredibly effective. Yeah. And it's the first thing I teach every one of my clients, because it's really a tool you put in your toolbox. Yeah. And you can use it at any time. And in my experience, it's the most effective management tool when your nervous system gets overloaded, when there is emotional overwhelm, whether that's anxiety or sadness or whatever it may be, anger. It's really powerful to very quickly regulate the nervous system. And then that obviously allows us to react differently than, just firing off. And the beautiful thing with it is that we just need our hands. So we all have our two hands.
Yeah.
And you are not dependent on anybody else. Obviously, there is certain forms of applications where you would go to a practitioner, when you do like the deep trauma work. So what I'm going to share with you is just a very simple havening touch, which is a self-regulation tool, right? Yeah. And anybody can follow along with that because it's just so simple. So you put your left hand on the right shoulder. Oh, I'm wearing a jacket.
So left hand
and right hand on the left shoulder. So it's much easier than it sounds. And then you start stroking from the shoulder to the elbow in one direction. Only one direction.
Only one, don't rub.
Yeah. So if you go like that, you're going to fire yourself up, Like if you're already anxious, it's not going to help. Yes. So it's in one direction only, from the shoulder to the elbow. And I mean, right now I'm wearing this jacket, you're wearing your jumper. Obviously, if you wear a t-shirt and it's on your skin, it's even more effective.
Yeah.
And, that's a very basic havening touch from the shoulder to the elbow. And just doing that for a little bit, you already notice how calming this actually feels.
It feels nice, and it feels grounding, because I think it's going down, it's that, it's lovely.
Yeah, and what we're doing right now is we're generating delta brain waves. And delta brain waves are highly relaxing, right? So if you were feeling really anxious right now, I mean, we've been doing this for a few seconds now, and like both you and I, we're kind of like, like you can very quickly regulate your nervous system, and you release serotonin and oxytocin, and it's just so nice. And there is also the face. So some people love it, others don't really like it that much. But it's simply just, rubbing your forehead and your cheeks. And if you think about it, I mean, what do we do when we get stressed?
Absolutely.
We rub our forehead, right?
And this actually explains, because I sometimes do people's makeup for the show or for theatre shows. I always say it's so nice. Therapeutic, because you are doing exactly this.
Yeah, it's my favorite part when I go get a massage. I love it. It's just so nice. And again, there are some people that really don't like touching their face, but then you can just rub your arms. And then my favorite one is actually the public-friendly version, which is simply rubbing your hands together in a circular motion.
Oh!
Just like that.
Just like this.
And,
circular.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
And the thing with that is, nobody knows what you're doing there, right? But what you are doing is you're regulating your nervous system. So whether you're on public transport or you're in a meeting, you're dealing with a difficult person, you can literally stand in front of them like that. They don't know what you're doing. You can be in a meeting, you do it under the table, on the table. When I do public speaking, like for me, this is actually unconscious at this point. When my nervous system feels like it needs to regulate, you will see me doing this. Yeah. And sometimes I do it even when I do public speaking on stage. I don't even notice it. But I'm talking, and for some reason, whatever, I get nervous or whatnot. Somebody in the audience does something that throws you off or whatnot. Doesn't matter. Then I've caught myself standing there, and while I'm talking, I'm doing this. But I mean, some people will know what I'm doing because I usually teach that at the beginning of every session I do. But it just becomes such a go-to tool to use. And then if you are in a challenging situation, like you're talking with somebody, or maybe a parent, pushing buttons, you just talk with them and you do this. They don't know what you're doing. Yeah. You're regulating your nervous system, and instead of firing off from the emotion,
you're able to keep more...
Yeah, you're regulated. So then obviously you have a whole different set of options how to respond in that particular situation, because your nervous system is calm rather than activated. So that's the public-friendly version. The most effective one from a delta brainwaves point of view is the arms. But I mean, you can do that when you watch TV. Yes. You can sit there and literally just go like that. And as I said, there are different kinds of applications to it where you would ask a practitioner. Like you can, for example, remove emotional charges from a memory. very, very gently. And I mean, what it does at the end of the day, I use it in all my sessions. I teach the clients, and then they can haven themselves while we're doing the trauma release work. And it just allows us to feel safe.
And that really was something that was so significant in your talk. When you mentioned hypnosis, it was one of those, I've underlined this. It's the knowledge that hypnosis puts you into a state which tells and teaches your client that it is accessible to them to be relaxed.
Absolutely.
And for somebody, and you see it when they're carrying so much with them, that thought of being relaxed is almost, it's almost scary, because it's kind of, well, what happens if I put this all down? It's all going to spill out onto the floor. But also for some, they just think it's not possible for me.
I mean, there are also people that never have experienced it, you know. They may have been anxious their whole life.
Yes.
Maybe their mother was a very anxious person, and they've not known anything else for all of their lives. But it's literally a state that's accessible to all of us, and it's really easy to get to that point. And it is scary the first time you do it, because obviously there is that whole thing about control.
Yes.
But the thing is, first of all, there's always free will, right? And you can open your eyes anytime you want. My hypnosis work actually is not somebody is like knocked out on a couch or something, you know. The person is actually speaking with me. They have their eyes closed, they have it open, whatever they prefer. So there is like this whole misconcept about hypnosis. But what happens is, once we actually learn that this is a state that's accessible for us, it's actually something that we are looking for. So then what I get oftentimes is that somebody sits down and they already go in trance without me even doing anything.
Yes.
You know, because they know that now is their special time, so they can just relax and let go of everything else.
It's really interesting, because I'm a coach, but quite a talking coach. Which works for the clients who come to me. But with one of them, I've started doing just a 5-minute meditation to get them into a space where it suits them, and they look forward to that. They almost need that before the session. And it does make for a broader session, because they can access so much more without feeling angry, usually, because it's usually work related. And I just think that aspect is quite underappreciated sometimes in traditional therapies. But the other thing which you said, and this is probably my last question, but it relates to what you were saying about how people come to you at the end of that, they're at this point, and they've had to go through this point. Now, this point, it is very much about fairness, justice. I'm angry, I want. And how does someone make that switch between, but I want them to pay to almost release that control they have over me?
Havening will help. For example. And I mean, it's absolutely normal to feel angry. And if you think about women, we are told to not be angry ever. And just allowing ourselves to experience that anger is a totally new experience as well, right? So it's not like because we are angry or we are sad, there's something wrong with us, because it's, as I said earlier, it's like a very natural response given the situation that we've experienced. It only becomes a problem when it stays, right? And when it's not in relation to the context, when it's kind of like an overreaction, right? It's not like we would want to take away from someone to feel angry or to feel sad, right? So that's actually important, and we need to allow ourselves to feel those emotions, even though they are uncomfortable. But how do we shift out of that? It also, I mean, it's a decision that we make. Like I said, I got to the point where, well, you know what, I'm just done with this. And it's the acceptance that comes in, that we can't change what happened anyway, and then we decide what we're going to do with that. It also has to do with your value system, actually, because a lot of change happens by advocates, that they are super fired up, they're super angry, their biggest value is justice, and they fight for the rest of us to make changes in legislation and those kind of things. For me, justice isn't a top value, so I made the decision for myself. I accept that it is unfair. There's nothing I can do about it. I want to focus on the healing and moving forward and letting that go, rather than getting revenge, rather than getting legal justice, which we rarely get anyway. So it's a personal decision to make. And but then even with the advocates, and they need that anger.
Yes, because
they need that anger to drive them forward. But again, it's attached to the value system. So my value system is different. So what drives me forward is making a difference in helping people rather than making changes on that level. But of course, and they are still struggling with the anger, with their triggers, with their mental health. But it comes down to every person and what's important to you. And even there are always management tools. So if that drives you, you can still apply, for example, havening to regulate that anger, or you can resolve parts of it that doesn't serve you, right? Because the whole point of healing work is to hold on to everything you really like about yourself and let go of everything that doesn't serve you. And it's the beauty of it, right? That we can actually become authentically in who we are. And if somebody who has justice as their highest value system, it's authentic to them.
Yes.
So you wouldn't want to take that away.
Yes. And the value system is actually really important, because the one that I use is the Martin Seligman values in action, and there's, I think it's 24 values that come under different categories. And what's really sad, I find sometimes with people who I've done this with, they'll look at it and go, oh, well, bravery is really low at the bottom, but perseverance is really high up. How can I be proud of that? And I actually think that's so important. All values are important, and not one of them is better than the other. It's how we utilize them.
Exactly. And it's how we perceive ourselves and what's important to us, which in fact can change, right, over time. Of course. So with value systems, the interesting thing is, before somebody does their healing work, they may hold a certain value system, and then they do their healing work, and all of a sudden all of that changes, especially when it's about career and acknowledgement and money and things like that, right?
Oh my goodness, Ronia, I could talk to you all day, and I would love to talk to you all day, which is why we brought you back in. I would love to have you on the show again, because this is just, obviously the conversation isn't going to stop here. How can we get hold of you? How can people find you if now they really want to seek your support?
You can find me online, obviously, on Instagram and Facebook. I don't do TikTok, I'm too old. No, I gotta get into it. But right now, Instagram and Facebook is Rock and Roll Coach Ronnie, and my website is roniafraser.com. So if you have any questions, if something stimulated your curiosity, please do feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to hear from people.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ronia. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is our live special of Mental Health Matters. And we will see you on Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. PT. Have a healthy week. Audrey Tang, a chartered psychologist, and on my show, Mental Health Matters, we take a deep dive into all things mental health and well-being with the experts. So join us at 8 a.m. PST on Thursdays on the Fresh Takes channel, because mental health matters on E360 TV.